The woman who stopped running. Eleanor Brooks stood in the doorway of the Crow Ranch house, a rifle in her hands and three terrified children behind her, watching armed strangers ride hard across the New Mexico dust. She'd promised herself she was done running, done hiding, done letting fear decide where her children would sleep and whether they'd wake up safe. But as the riders closed in, men she recognized, men who'd tracked her across 2 territories and 4 months of desperate flight. She understood that some promises can only be kept with powder and lead. The question wasn't whether she'd run again. It was whether she'd survive long enough to make that choice. If you want to know how a widowed rancher and a desperate woman built something worth fighting for in the unforgiving New Mexico territory, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Eleanor's story reaches across this country. The notice had been simple, blunt even, the kind of thing a man writes when he's given up on expecting much from the world. Ranch cook wanted. Room and board. Must tolerate children and keep a quiet house. No gossips. No questions. Inquire at Crow Ranch, 6 miles south of Bent Creek, New Mexico territory. Daniel Crow had nailed it to the post outside Mackey's General Store on a Tuesday morning in late April 1887, then ridden back to his ranch without waiting to see if anyone would read it. He didn't have much hope. The last cook had lasted 3 weeks before deciding that a household of sullen men and a grief-stricken widower wasn't worth the wages, no matter how desperate she'd been. The house had been empty of a woman's presence for 2 years, ever since Sarah died. Daniel didn't talk about Sarah, didn't keep her things where he could see them, didn't visit her grave more than once a season. He'd learned that grief was like a wounded animal. The more you poked at it, the more it bit back. So he worked, rose before dawn, worked until his hands bled, fell into bed too exhausted to dream. His ranch hands had learned not to expect conversation. His neighbors had learned not to expect visits. The house reflected the man. Functional, spare, clean enough to pass inspection, but devoid of anything that suggested comfort or care. The kitchen was the worst of it, a space that had once smelled of fresh bread and coffee, now smelled of dust and old smoke. Daniel cooked what he had to, ate without tasting, and tried not to remember what it had been like when someone had loved him enough to make a home. 3 days after he'd posted the notice, a wagon appeared at the end of his long dirt road. Daniel was in the barn, shoeing a mare that had thrown a shoe that morning. He heard the creak of wheels, the slow plod of a tired horse, and straightened to watch through the open barn door. The wagon was old but well-maintained, pulled by a single gray gelding that looked like it had seen better days but wasn't ready to quit yet. The driver was a woman in a faded blue dress and a plain bonnet that shadowed her face. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and sat there for a long moment, as if gathering courage. Then she climbed down with the careful movements of someone who'd learned to conserve energy, and 3 children emerged from the back of the wagon like ghosts. Daniel set down his tools and walked toward them, wiping his hands on his pants. The woman turned to face him as he approached. She was somewhere in her 30s, he guessed, though it was hard to tell. Her face had the kind of weariness that aged a person beyond their years, fine lines around her eyes, a tightness to her mouth that spoke of worry carried too long. But her eyes were clear and steady, and when she met his gaze, she didn't look away. "Mr. Crow?" Her voice was low and even, with an Eastern quality to it, not refined exactly, but educated. "That's right. I'm here about the position, ranch cook." Daniel glanced at the children. 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 12. The oldest boy stood slightly in front of his siblings, one hand resting protectively on the younger boy's shoulder. All 3 watched Daniel with the kind of wariness that came from experience, not instruction. "Notice didn't mention children," Daniel said. "It didn't say no children either." The woman's tone didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Challenge, maybe. Or desperation disguised as confidence. Daniel studied her. She was too thin, and the dress she wore had been mended more than once. The children's clothes were clean but threadbare. The wagon held 3 small trunks and a collection of kitchen implements that suggested she'd done this work before. "You got a name?" he asked. "Eleanor Brooks. Widow. These are my children, Thomas, James, and Sarah." She gestured to each in turn. The older boy nodded. The younger 2 just stared. The name hit him like a fist. "Sarah." He forced himself not to react, but the woman, Eleanor, saw it anyway. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I can use a different name for her, if it's difficult," she said quietly. "She answers to Sally, too." "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. "Sarah's fine. It's just a name." Eleanor nodded, accepting the lie because it was easier than the truth. "You know how to cook for ranch hands?" Daniel asked, redirecting. "I've got 5 men who work this land. They eat like they're hollow. I've cooked for larger crews. I can manage." "You got references?" Something shuddered behind her eyes. "No, sir. We've been traveling. My last position ended abruptly." Daniel waited, but she didn't elaborate. He should have pressed. Should have asked why a woman with 3 children would be traveling alone through New Mexico territory without references or apparent means. Should have recognized the signs of someone running from something. But he was tired of cooking his own meals and eating alone, tired of a house that echoed with absence, tired of pretending he didn't need help. "Room and board," he said. "There's a cabin out back that's been empty since my foreman moved to the bunkhouse. It's small, but it's got a stove and 2 rooms. You'll cook 3 meals a day for me and the hands. Keep the main house clean. I don't need conversation, and I don't need questions. You do the work, I pay fair wages at the end of each month. That acceptable?" Eleanor's shoulders dropped half an inch, and Daniel realized she'd been holding herself rigid with tension. "Yes, sir. That's more than acceptable." "Thomas can help with chores if he's willing. The younger 2 stay out of the barn and away from the horses unless I'm there to supervise. This is a working ranch, and it's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." "Understood." Daniel gestured toward the small cabin visible beyond the main house. "Get yourself settled. There's firewood stacked on the north side, and the well's between the cabin and the house. Supper's at 6. I'll expect you in the kitchen by 5 to get things started." Eleanor nodded, then turned to gather her children. Thomas climbed back onto the wagon seat to drive it around to the cabin. The other 2 followed on foot. The little girl, Sarah, he reminded himself, glancing back once at the big house with something like longing. Daniel watched them go, then returned to the barn and his work. He told himself he'd made a practical decision. Nothing more. He told himself he wasn't hoping for anything. Eleanor Brooks knew how to make herself invisible. It was a skill she'd learned over the past 4 months, refined through necessity and fear. You kept your head down. Spoke when spoken to. Worked hard enough that people noticed your value, but not so hard that they noticed you. You made yourself useful and unmemorable in equal measure. The cabin was better than she'd expected. Small, yes, just 2 rooms with a narrow loft where the boys could sleep, but solid. The roof didn't leak. The stove worked. There was a table and 4 mismatched chairs, a bed frame in the back room, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. It was the first place in 4 months that felt like it might be safe enough to breathe. "Can we stay here, Mama?" Sarah asked, her small voice tentative. Eleanor knelt and pulled her daughter close. "For now, sweetheart. For now." Thomas, ever practical at 12 years old, was already unpacking their few possessions. "I'll sleep in the loft with James. You and Sarah can take the back room." "Thank you, Thomas." Eleanor stood and began organizing their kitchen supplies. She had 2 hours before she needed to report to the main house, and she intended to use every minute to make this place feel like home. By 5 o'clock, she'd scrubbed the cabin clean, made up beds with their threadbare linens, and unpacked their clothing into the single trunk they used as a dresser. The boys had hauled water from the well, and Sarah had arranged their few books on a shelf Thomas had fashioned from an old crate. Eleanor changed into her other dress, slightly less worn than the one she'd traveled in, and pinned her dark hair back into a tight bun. She studied her reflection in the small mirror she'd propped against the wall. She looked like what she was, a woman past her prime, hollowed out by hardship, held together by will alone. Good. Let him see a tired widow who needed work. Let him see someone grateful and compliant. Let him see anything except the truth. She walked to the main house as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The kitchen door was unlocked and she let herself in. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. Not dirty, exactly, but neglected. The kind of space where a man cooked because he had to, not because he cared. Pots hung from hooks, but they needed proper cleaning. The stove was functional, but hadn't been seasoned in months. The pantry held staples, flour, cornmeal, beans, salt pork, but nothing that suggested thought or variety. Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She found potatoes in a bin, onions hanging in a net, and a side of bacon that needed slicing. Within 20 minutes, she had a pot of beans simmering, potatoes frying in bacon grease, and cornbread baking in the oven. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and substantial, the kind of meal that would fill working men and leave them satisfied. At 6 o'clock precisely, the hands began filing in through the back door. 5 men, just as Daniel had said, ranging from a grizzled cowboy who looked to be in his 60s to a kid who couldn't have been more than 17. They stopped short when they saw Eleanor at the stove. "Ma'am," the oldest one said, removing his hat, "didn't know Crow had hired on." "Mrs. Brooks," Eleanor said, nodding politely. "I'm the new cook. Supper's ready if you'd like to wash up." They did, using the basin by the door with the kind of efficiency that spoke of long practice. Daniel appeared last, his expression carefully neutral. Eleanor served the meal in silence, placing heaping plates in front of each man. They ate without conversation at first, the kind of focused consumption that came from genuine hunger. But gradually she heard the shift, small sounds of appreciation, the scrape of forks slowing as they savored rather than simply consumed. "This is real good, ma'am," the young one finally ventured. "Thank you." The grizzled cowboy, introduced by the others as Hank, nodded his agreement. "Haven't had cooking like this since, well, in a good while." Eleanor saw Daniel's jaw tighten, but he said nothing. She cleaned as they ate, washing pots and wiping down surfaces with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times. When the men finished, they brought their plates to her at the basin, murmuring thanks. Daniel was last. "That was acceptable," he said quietly. Eleanor almost smiled. Acceptable. High praise, apparently, from Daniel Crow. "I'll have breakfast ready at 5:30, she said, "unless you need it earlier." 5:30's fine." He paused, as if considering whether to say more, then simply nodded and left. Eleanor finished cleaning, banked the fire in the stove, and returned to the cabin. Thomas and James were already asleep in the loft, and Sarah was fighting to keep her eyes open. "Did it go well, Mama?" she whispered as Eleanor helped her into her nightgown. "It did, sweetheart. We're going to be all right here." "Do you promise?" Eleanor smoothed her daughter's hair and kissed her forehead. "I promise I'll do everything I can to keep us safe. Now sleep." She lay awake long after Sarah's breathing had evened out into sleep, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, horses shifting in the barn, the distant yip of coyotes, the creak of the cabin settling. She'd been running for 4 months. 4 months of looking over her shoulder, of changing their names, of taking work where she could find it and leaving before questions could be asked. 4 months of teaching her children to lie, to be quiet, to trust no one. She'd told herself she was protecting them, and she was. But she was also tired. Tired of fear. Tired of running. Tired of being alone. The Crow Ranch felt different. Remote enough to be safe, but stable enough to offer the illusion of permanence. And Daniel Crow, he was a man who kept to himself, who didn't ask questions, who seemed to understand the value of silence. Maybe, Eleanor thought, they could stay here. Maybe this could be the place where they finally stopped running. But 4 months of fear had taught her not to hope too hard. So she lay in the dark and told herself to be grateful for one safe night. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Daniel Crow woke at 4:30, same as always. His body knew the rhythm even before his mind caught up. Pull on clothes in the dark, splash water on his face from the basin, lace boots with fingers that moved by memory. The house was different. He noticed it the moment he stepped into the hallway. It smelled like coffee. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. Eleanor stood at the stove, her back to him, already working. The coffee pot was hot. Fresh biscuits were rising under a cloth, and she was slicing salt pork with the kind of precision that spoke of professional skill. She turned when she heard him. "Good morning, Mr. Crow. Coffee's ready." He grunted, which was as close to thanks as he usually got before sunrise, and poured himself a cup. He sat at the table, his table, in his kitchen, except it didn't feel quite like his anymore, and watched her work. She moved with economy and grace. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She knew where everything was already, had organized the kitchen in a single evening to suit her workflow. The biscuits went into the oven, eggs cracked into a bowl, bacon laid out in a skillet. "You're up early?" he finally said. "Ranch hours." Eleanor didn't look up from her work. "I'm used to it." "Where'd you work before?" The slightest pause, almost imperceptible. "Colorado. Cattle ranch outside of Pueblo." "Big operation?" "Big enough." She turned to face him, meeting his eyes with that same steady gaze. "Is there something specific you'd like to know, Mr. Crow?" "Yes," he thought. "I'd like to know why a woman with your skills is willing to work for room and board in the middle of nowhere. I'd like to know why you travel with everything you own in 3 trunks. I'd like to know what you're running from." But he'd promised no questions, and Daniel Crow kept his word. "Just making conversation," he said. "I understood the position didn't require conversation." Point taken. Daniel finished his coffee in silence and went out to begin the day's work. By the time he and the hands came in for breakfast at 6, the kitchen smelled like heaven. Biscuits, gravy, eggs, fried potatoes, bacon. Real food, cooked with care. The kind of breakfast that made hard work possible. The men ate with focused appreciation. Daniel found himself eating more than he had in months, his body responding to proper nutrition after too long on coffee and whatever he could throw together quickly. "Mrs. Brooks," Hank said between bites, "if you can cook like this regular, we might actually survive the summer in decent shape." Eleanor, washing dishes at the basin, allowed herself a small smile. "I'll do my best." The days fell into rhythm. Eleanor cooked, cleaned, and managed the household with quiet efficiency. Her children kept to themselves, appearing only at mealtimes or when Thomas came to help with chores. The boy was a hard worker. Daniel noticed that immediately. 12 years old and already understood the value of honest labor. A week passed, then 2. The ranch hands grew comfortable with her presence, started joking at meals, started asking for particular dishes. She accommodated when she could, but never in a way that suggested she was trying to please. She simply did her work, accepted her wages, and kept her distance. Daniel told himself he didn't care, told himself he'd hired a cook, not a companion, told himself the fact that his house felt more like a home now was simply a byproduct of having someone competent managing it. But he noticed things, small things. The way Eleanor's hand shook sometimes when she poured coffee in the morning. The way she positioned herself in the kitchen so she could always see the door. The way her children never strayed far from the cabin, never played loudly, never drew attention. They were afraid of something, all of them. It was Hank who finally said what Daniel had been thinking. "She's running," the old cowboy said one evening as they worked on mending fence line. "That woman and her kids. They're running from something." Daniel drove a post into the ground harder than necessary. "Not our business." Didn't say it was, just saying I recognize the look. Seen it before on women who got good reason to disappear. "You got a point, or are you just gossiping like an old woman?" Hank spat tobacco juice and grinned. "Point is, she cooks better than anyone we've had in 2 years. She works hard, and she don't cause trouble. Whatever she's running from, I figure she earned the right to run. Long as she keeps feeding us like this, I don't care what she's hiding." Daniel nodded slowly. "Agreed." They worked in silence for a while, then Hank spoke again, his voice more serious. "But if trouble comes looking for her, it might come looking for us too. You thought about that?" Daniel had, every day since she'd arrived. "If trouble comes, we'll handle it." "Just like that?" "Just like that." Hank studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. Good to know where we stand." That night, Daniel lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere in the cabin beyond his window, Eleanor Brooks was probably lying awake too, listening to the same sounds and wondering if tonight would be the night her past caught up with her. He'd meant what he said to Hank. If trouble came, they'd handle it. But as sleep finally claimed him, Daniel Crow wondered if he was protecting a woman who needed help, or if he was simply tired of being alone with his grief. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, Another day of pretending that the quiet widow in his kitchen was exactly what she claimed to be. Nothing more, nothing less. The truth, Daniel suspected, was something else entirely. But truth had a way of revealing itself, whether you wanted it to or not. 3 weeks into Eleanor's employment, Thomas approached Daniel in the barn. The boy had been working alongside the hands for the past week, learning to mend tack and muck stalls with the kind of steady determination that reminded Daniel of himself at that age. He didn't complain, didn't shirk, and didn't expect praise for simply doing what needed doing. "Mr. Crow?" Thomas stood in the barn doorway, hat in his hands. "May I speak with you, sir?" Daniel set down the bridle he'd been oiling. "What's on your mind?" Thomas stepped inside, glancing back toward the cabin where Eleanor was hanging laundry with Sarah's help. "I wanted to ask, that is, I wanted to know—" He stopped, frustrated with himself. "Take your time," Daniel said. The boy straightened his shoulders. "Are we safe here?" The question hit Daniel square in the chest. Not because it was unexpected, he'd known it was coming eventually, but because of the weight behind it. This wasn't a child asking if he could go play by the creek. This was someone who'd learned to calculate risk, asking for an honest assessment of their situation. Daniel pulled over an overturned bucket and sat, gesturing for Thomas to do the same. The boy perched on a hay bale, still holding his hat like a shield. "What makes you ask?" Daniel said carefully. "Mama doesn't sleep much. I hear her walking at night, checking the windows, and she makes us practice." He stopped abruptly. "Practice what?" Thomas hesitated, then the words came out in a rush. "Practice leaving quickly. If we have to run again. She's got our things packed in the wagon still, even though we've been here almost a month. She says it's just being prepared, but I know better." Daniel absorbed this, his suspicions confirmed. "Your mother's had a hard time." "I know, but I'm tired of running, Mr. Crow. James and Sarah, they're too young to understand, but I'm tired. I want to stay somewhere. Go to school maybe. Have friends." His voice cracked slightly. "I want to stop being afraid." "Does your mother know you feel this way?" "I can't tell her. She's doing the best she can, and if I complain, it'll just make her feel worse." Thomas looked up, and his eyes, so young but carrying such old worry, met Daniel's. "So I'm asking you, are we safe here? Can we stay?" Daniel chose his words carefully. "I can't promise you absolute safety. Nobody can. But I can tell you this. While you're on this ranch, you're under my protection, all of you, and I don't take that responsibility lightly. Even if someone came looking for us? Especially then." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. "Mama won't tell you why we're running. She made us all swear not to talk about it. I'm not asking you to break a promise to your mother. But you want to know. I want to help. Sometimes that's easier if I know what I'm helping with, but I respect your mother's right to her privacy." Daniel paused. "You're carrying a heavy load for someone your age. Someone has to. Mama's strong, but she can't do everything alone." "No," Daniel agreed quietly. "Nobody can." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the barn filled with the familiar sounds of horses shifting and swallows nesting in the rafters. "I like it here," Thomas finally said. "The work is hard, but it's honest, and you treat me like I matter, not like I'm just a kid in the way. You do good work. You've earned the respect." Thomas stood, fitting his hat back on his head. "Thank you, Mr. Crow, for being straight with me." "Thomas," Daniel said as the boy turned to leave, "if your mother asks what we talked about, she won't. She tries not to ask questions because she doesn't want to answer any." Thomas smiled sadly. That's how it's been for a while now. After the boy left, Daniel sat alone in the barn for a long time, thinking about the promises he'd just made and wondering if he could keep them. Eleanor Brooks had brought more than cooking skills to his ranch. She'd brought complications, secrets, the kind of trouble that came looking for people whether they wanted it to or not. The smart thing would be to let her go now, before whatever she was running from arrived at his doorstep. But Daniel Crow had learned something in the 2 years since Sarah died. Being smart and being alive weren't the same thing. He'd spent 2 years being smart, keeping his head down, doing his work, avoiding anything that might crack the carefully constructed shell around his grief. Eleanor and her children had cracked it anyway, not through any fault of their own, but simply by being there, by filling his house with the sounds of life, by reminding him what it felt like to protect something that mattered. He stood and returned to his work, but his mind kept circling back to one thought. Whatever Eleanor Brooks was running from, it would catch up eventually, and when it did, Daniel intended to be standing in its way. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-May, riding hard and raising dust. Eleanor was in the kitchen kneading dough for the noon meal when she heard the horses. Not the familiar sound of the ranch hands moving cattle or Daniel working in the corral, but something different, urgent. Multiple riders coming fast, her hands stilled in the flour. Through the window, she could see 3 men she didn't recognize pulling up near the barn. They wore trail dust and hard expressions, and the way they sat their horses, loose in the saddle but ready, told her everything she needed to know. They'd found her. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she wiped the flour away and untied her apron. 4 months of running had taught her not to panic. Panic got you killed. Clear thinking and quick action kept you breathing. She moved to the kitchen door and stepped outside, positioning herself where she could see, but also where she could run if needed. The cabin was 40 yards away. If she could reach it, get the children, get to the wagon. Help you, gentlemen? Daniel's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He'd emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his posture casual but his eyes alert. The lead rider was a thick-shouldered man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than out of it. Looking for a woman, widow, traveling with 3 kids, dark hair, probably calling herself something ordinary. Brooks, maybe. Or Smith? Or Jones? Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Daniel's expression didn't change. What's she wanted for? Arson, theft, conspiracy to defraud. The man's smile was ugly. She killed a man in Colorado, then ran before she could hang for it. That's a lie. The words were out before Eleanor could stop them. All eyes turned to her. The scarred man's smile widened. Well now, he said, taking a step toward her. Looks like our information was good after all. Daniel moved, putting himself between Eleanor and the riders with a casual shift that looked accidental, but absolutely wasn't. On whose authority are you making these accusations? Victor Hale's authority. He's got legal claim to Mrs. Brooks and compensation owed for damages she caused. We're authorized to bring her back to Colorado to face justice. Victor Hale. Eleanor's voice shook with rage rather than fear. Victor Hale is a liar and a criminal who's never faced justice in his life. The scarred man ignored her, addressing Daniel instead. You the owner here? Daniel Crow. This is my land. Then you've been harboring a fugitive, Mr. Crow. Might want to step aside before you find yourself facing charges, too. Daniel didn't move. I've been employing a cook. Far as I know, Mrs. Brooks hasn't broken any laws, and I don't see any badges on you 3, which means you've got no legal authority to do anything on my property except leave. We don't need badges. We've got Mr. Hale's writ and his money, and that's authority enough. Not in New Mexico territory, it isn't. Daniel's voice stayed level, but something had changed in his stance. Eleanor recognized it, the shift from conversation to confrontation. Now, I'm going to give you boys a choice. You can ride out of here peaceful, or you can stay and find out how we handle trespassers on the Crow Ranch. The scarred man's hand drifted toward his gun. You threatening us? Stating facts, my land, my rules, and my rule is simple. You leave now, or you leave bleeding. Hank appeared from the barn, rifle held casually but ready. 2 more ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, also armed. The young one, Billy, looked nervous, but his gun was steady. The odds had shifted. The scarred man calculated, his eyes moving from Daniel to the armed hands to Eleanor and back. Mr. Hale's not going to like this. Mr. Hale can file a proper complaint with the territorial marshal if he's got legitimate grievances. Until then, he can keep his hired guns off my property. For a long moment, nobody moved. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of her children's safety pressing down on her chest. Thomas would be in the barn loft where she'd told him to stay during the day. James and Sarah were supposed to be at the cabin, but she could see Sarah's small face peeking around the corner of the house. If shooting started, her daughter was exposed. "Sarah, inside," Eleanor said quietly but firmly. The little girl disappeared immediately. The scarred man noticed the exchange and smiled again. "3 kids, just like we heard? That the youngest? Pretty little thing." Daniel's hand moved to his own gun. "You've got 10 seconds to get on your horses. Then I start shooting, and I don't miss." "You'd kill 3 men over a woman you barely know?" "I'd kill 3 trespassers threatening people under my protection. What you call it doesn't matter much to me." The math was simple, and the scarred man knew it. 3 against 4, and they were the ones caught in the open. He raised his hand slowly, showing empty palms. "We're leaving, for now. But this isn't finished, Crow. Mr. Hale doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. Neither do I." The men mounted up, the scarred one last. Before he turned his horse, he looked at Eleanor. "You can't hide forever, Mrs. Brooks, and when you run out of men stupid enough to protect you, Victor will be waiting." They rode out, taking their time about it, making sure everyone understood they were leaving by choice, not because they were afraid. Eleanor didn't breathe properly until they disappeared over the ridge. Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Inside. Now." She followed him into the kitchen, her legs shaking with delayed reaction. Daniel closed the door and leaned against it, studying her with those steady gray eyes. "So," he said quietly, "are you going to tell me the truth now, or do I have to wait until the next group shows up?" Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands gripping the table edge to keep them from trembling. "I didn't kill anyone. But the rest of it? The rest is complicated." "Then uncomplicate it." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Because those men will be back, probably with more friends, and I need to know what I'm protecting you from." Eleanor closed her eyes, gathering the threads of a story she'd tried so hard to bury. When she opened them again, Daniel was waiting with the patience of a man who knew some truths took time. "Victor Hale owned the Silver Dollar Saloon in Pueblo," she began, her voice low. "He also owned the building next to it, where I lived with my children. My husband died 3 years ago, consumption, and left us with nothing but debts. Victor offered me work in the saloon kitchen, said he'd forgive the debt if I worked it off. But he wanted more than kitchen work. He wanted me. In his bed, at his beck and call. When I refused, he started raising my rent, adding fees, claiming I owed for damages I never caused. Within 6 months, I was so deep in debt I'd never get free, and he made it clear, work off the debt his way or he'd have me arrested for theft and take my children to pay what I owed." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So you ran?" "I tried to first, legally, I mean. Went to the marshal, but Victor owns half the law in Pueblo. Then I went to a lawyer, but he said without proof of coercion, I'd signed the contracts and I was bound by them. Victor made sure everything looked legitimate on paper." "What changed?" Eleanor met his eyes. "He came to my room one night, drunk and angry because I'd refused him again. He tried to force himself on me. Thomas heard and came running with a kitchen knife. Victor backhanded him across the room, and Thomas hit his head on the stove. There was so much blood." Her voice broke. Daniel waited. Thomas was unconscious. Sarah was screaming. James was trying to pull Victor away from me. And I realized if I stayed, Victor would eventually get what he wanted. Either I'd break or he'd take it by force, and my children would watch their mother destroyed piece by piece. "So you fought back." I grabbed the lamp off the table and hit him with it. The oil spilled. The flame caught. Victor was on fire, screaming, trying to beat it out. I grabbed my children and ran. We took what we could carry and left everything else burning. Daniel absorbed this. "Did Victor die?" "I don't know. We didn't stay to find out. I heard later that the building burned and Victor was claiming I'd tried to murder him and robbed him before I left. He put out word he wanted me brought back alive to face justice." Her laugh was bitter. "His version of justice. The arson charge is real then, I suppose. Though it was his oil lamp and his violence that started the fire, I'm the one who'll hang for it if he catches me. And the theft? I took the money from the saloon till. $300. It was less than half what he'd stolen from me in fake fees and inflated rent. But legally, I suppose it counts as theft. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he'd built his life on. Eleanor watched him, waiting for the judgment she knew was coming, waiting for him to tell her to pack up and leave before she brought more trouble to his door. Instead, he turned back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Victor Hale sounds like the kind of man who needs killing," Daniel said conversationally. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "If what you're telling me is true, and I believe it is, then Victor Hale is a predator who uses the law to legitimize his crimes. Men like that don't stop until someone stops them. I'm not asking you to kill him. I know, you're not asking for anything except a chance to work and keep your children safe. But now I've got the full picture, and I can make informed decisions about what happens next." "What does happen next?" Daniel sat back down, folding his hands on the table. "Next, you stop running. You stay here, do your work, and let me handle anyone else Victor sends. You can't fight all of them. He has money, and money buys guns. I have land, and land buys loyalty. Every man working this ranch knows what it means when someone comes onto our property making threats. They'll stand." "Why?" The question burst out of Eleanor before she could stop it. "Why would you risk your life, your ranch, your men, for someone you barely know?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. 2 years ago, my wife Sarah died giving birth to our daughter. The baby died too. I buried them both on a Tuesday morning in March, and I've been half dead myself ever since." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I went through the motions," Daniel continued. "Worked the ranch, paid the hands, kept the place running, but I stopped living. Just existed. Then you showed up with your children and your secrets, and for the first time in 2 years, my house feels like a home again. I hear laughter. I smell real cooking. I watch your boy work like he's got something to prove, and I remember what it felt like to have purpose beyond just surviving another day." He looked at her directly. "So maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe I'm protecting you because it gives me a reason to care about something again. Or maybe I'm just tired of watching bad men win because good people are too afraid to stand up. Either way, the answer's the same. You stay. We face whatever comes, and Victor Hale can go to hell." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. A pressure she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. For 4 months, she'd been alone. Completely, terrifyingly alone. Making every decision, carrying every burden. Protecting 3 children with nothing but determination and desperation. Now someone was offering to share the weight. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll stop packing that wagon. Say you'll let those kids settle in properly. Say you'll trust me enough to stand still and fight instead of running." Eleanor thought of Thomas asking if they were safe here. Thought of Sarah arranging books on a shelf with the careful hope of someone who'd learned not to get attached. Thought of James, too young to understand why they kept leaving places just when they started to feel like home. "I'll stay," she said. "But if it gets too dangerous, if your men start getting hurt because of me, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But we deal with it together. Agreed?" "Agreed." Daniel stood and extended his hand across the table. Eleanor took it, feeling the calluses earned from years of hard work, the strength that came from more than just physical labor. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got to figure out how to handle Victor when he decides to escalate." "He will. Escalate, I mean. He doesn't like losing, and he especially doesn't like losing to women. Then he's about to learn a hard lesson about pride and consequences." Daniel released her hand and moved toward the door. "I'm riding into Bent Creek this afternoon to talk to the marshal, see what the legal situation actually is. You stay on the ranch, keep the children close. Hank will be on watch." "Should I be armed?" Daniel paused, considering. "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me. I'm not expert, but I can hit what I aim at. There's a rifle in the cabinet by the door. It's loaded. If anyone comes onto this property who isn't me or one of my men, you use it. Don't hesitate. Don't warn them twice. Just shoot." Eleanor nodded, the reality of their situation settling over her like a heavy cloak. After Daniel left, she returned to her bread dough, but her hands moved automatically while her mind raced. She'd told him the truth, mostly. The parts that mattered, anyway. But she'd left out details. The extent of Victor's connections, the fact that he'd killed before and covered it up, the way he'd looked at Sarah with an expression that still made Eleanor's skin crawl. Victor Hale wasn't just a criminal. He was a monster who'd learned to wear a respectable mask. And monsters didn't stop hunting just because you ran far enough or found someone willing to protect you. They kept coming until they got what they wanted or until someone put them down permanently. Eleanor shaped the dough into loaves with practiced efficiency, but her mind was already calculating. Distance to the wagon, time needed to harness the horse, routes out of the territory if running became necessary again. She'd promised Daniel she'd stay and fight, and she meant it. But she'd also promised herself she'd never let Victor Hale touch her children. And that promise, Eleanor knew, would trump everything else if the moment came to choose. The bread went into the oven. Eleanor washed her hands and walked to the cabinet Daniel had indicated. The rifle was well-maintained, oiled, and ready. She checked the load with hands that remembered her father's patient instruction from years ago, then returned it to the cabinet. Through the window, she could see Thomas working in the corral with one of the hands, learning to rope a post. Sarah and James were outside the cabin, Sarah reading aloud while James built something with sticks and twine. Normal children doing normal things. Except they weren't normal children anymore. They were children who knew how to pack a wagon in 5 minutes, who knew to be silent when strangers appeared, who knew that sometimes you had to run in the middle of the night and leave everything behind. Eleanor had done that to them. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but the result was the same. She'd turned her children into fugitives because she'd refused to let a monster have her. Now Daniel Crow was offering them something different, a chance to stand still, to put down roots, to stop being afraid every time horses approached. But that chance came with a price, and Eleanor knew who would pay it if things went wrong. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of fear. 60 seconds to imagine all the ways this could end badly. 60 seconds to feel the full weight of her choices. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes, and went back to work. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not anymore. Daniel returned from town just before supper, his expression grim. Eleanor was setting the table when he came in, and the ranch hands immediately sensed something had shifted. They ate quickly and quietly, then cleared out without their usual lingering conversation. When they were alone, Daniel poured himself coffee and sat heavily. "The marshal knows Victor Hale," he said without preamble. "Says he's got connections all the way to Denver, political friends, money in the right pockets. If he wants you brought back to Colorado, he's got the resources to make it happen legally." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "So I can't stay." "I didn't say that. I said if he goes the legal route, he's got the power to make it stick. But legal takes time. Warrants, extradition papers, territorial jurisdiction disputes. Could be months before anything official happens." Daniel met her eyes. "The problem is, Victor doesn't strike me as the patient type." "He's not. So he'll send more men, more guns. Eventually, he'll come himself. And when he does," Daniel's smile was cold, "when he does, we'll be ready. I've talked to the hands. They're all staying. Hank's sending word to a few friends who might be interested in hiring on for premium wages, given the circumstances. By the end of the week, we'll have 10 armed men on this property who understand exactly what they're protecting. That will cost you a fortune. I've got money saved, and my ranch, my choice how I spend it." Eleanor started to protest, but Daniel held up a hand. "Before you argue, understand something. This stopped being just about you the moment those men rode onto my land and made threats. Victor Hale just told me I don't have the right to decide who works my ranch or who I protect. That makes it personal. I don't tolerate that kind of disrespect, and I sure as hell don't back down from it. You're talking about a range war over a cook. I'm talking about principles, about standing up when it matters, about not letting rich men with dirty money dictate how decent people live their lives." Daniel leaned forward. "My whole life, I've watched men like Victor Hale take what they want and call it legal. Use the system to legitimize theft and violence and exploitation. I've watched them win because people like me, people who could stand up, decided it wasn't our fight. And now it is your fight? Now I've decided that if I'm going to live, I might as well live for something that matters. You and your children matter. The principle of protecting people who can't protect themselves matters. And making sure Victor Hale learns that money can't buy everything. That matters too. Eleanor sat down across from him, studying his face. She saw determination there, and anger, but also something else. Something that looked like purpose. Like a man who'd been sleepwalking for 2 years and had finally woken up. You know this might get you killed, she said quietly. Yeah. And you're willing to take that risk. I've been dead for 2 years already, just kept breathing out of habit. He gestured vaguely. This feels like living again. Even if it's dangerous, even if it ends badly, at least it's something real. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest. Probably both. Daniel's expression softened slightly. But for what it's worth, I think you're pretty brave yourself. Most people would have given up or given in. You kept fighting, kept your children safe, kept going when everything pointed to quitting. That takes strength. Or stubbornness. Same thing, mostly. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared purpose settling between them. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside, the kitchen smelled of coffee and bread and the beginnings of something that might have been hope. I should check on the children, Eleanor finally said. Get them to bed. Eleanor, Daniel's voice stopped her at the door. When this is over, when we've dealt with Victor and you're safe, I want you to know you've got a place here. Permanent, if you want it. Not just as a cook, as part of this ranch. Your children, too. Thomas has a future here if he wants it. They all do. Eleanor's throat tightened. You're offering me a home. I'm offering you a choice. To stay not because you're running from something, but because you're choosing something worth running toward. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and slipped out into the evening air. The cabin glowed with lamplight when she entered. Thomas looked up from the book he'd been reading to his siblings, his expression questioning. Are we leaving? He asked quietly. Eleanor sat down and pulled all 3 children close. No, sweetheart, we're not leaving. We're staying. We're going to fight. Fight how? Sarah's voice was small and frightened. By standing still. By letting good people help us. By trusting that sometimes the right thing to do is stop running and face what's chasing you. What if we lose? James asked. Eleanor kissed the top of his head. Then we lose knowing we tried. But I don't think we're going to lose. I think Mr. Crow is the kind of man who doesn't know how to quit. And I think maybe we've been running long enough. Maybe it's time to see what happens when we stand our ground. Thomas met her eyes over his siblings' heads. In his gaze, she saw relief and fear in equal measure, but also something else, something that looked like the beginnings of trust. I'm tired of being afraid, Mama, he whispered. Me too, baby. Me too. That night, for the first time in 4 months, Eleanor unpacked the wagon completely. She hung their clothes properly, arranged their few possessions with care, made the cabin feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. And when she finally lay down to sleep, she didn't position herself near the window to watch for approaching riders. Instead, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next town, the next job, the next desperate escape. Outside, Hank kept watch from the barn loft, his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the horizon. The ranch settled into the quiet rhythms of night, unaware that 2 days later, everything would change. Victor Hale arrived at noon on Saturday, and he didn't come quietly. Eleanor heard them first, the thunder of hooves that made her freeze mid-motion, a plate suspended in her soapy hands. Through the kitchen window, she counted 8 riders cresting the ridge, moving in formation like a military unit. They weren't trying to hide. They weren't trying to negotiate. They were coming to take what they believed belonged to them. Daniel! Her voice carried across the yard, sharp with warning. He was already moving, emerging from the barn with Hank and 2 other hands. The rest appeared from various positions around the ranch. Daniel had stationed them strategically after his trip to town, anticipating exactly this scenario. 10 men total now, thanks to the reinforcements Hank had recruited. They spread out with practiced efficiency, creating a defensive perimeter around the main house and cabin. Eleanor set down the plate with shaking hands and reached for the rifle. Behind her, she heard Thomas shepherding his siblings into the back bedroom, their footsteps quick but controlled. They'd practiced this, knew what to do when trouble came. The riders pulled up 50 yards from the house, close enough to be clearly seen but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. The man in the center sat his horse like he owned the world, and Eleanor's stomach clenched with recognition. Victor Hale had aged in 4 months, or perhaps the burns had simply revealed what had always been underneath. The left side of his face was scarred, twisted tissue that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. He'd been a handsome man once, had used that charm to seduce and manipulate. Now he looked like what he was, a monster wearing human skin. His eyes found Eleanor in the kitchen doorway, and his smile was terrible to see. "Eleanor, darling," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard with false warmth. "You've led me on quite a chase, but it's time to come home now, time to settle your debts." Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself directly in Victor's line of sight. "You've got no business here, Hale. Turn around and leave while you still can." Victor's gaze shifted to Daniel, assessing. "You must be the famous Daniel Crow, heard about you in town. Widower, keeps to himself, minds his own business, or at least you used to before my property seduced you into playing hero." "Mrs. Brooks isn't property. She's a free woman working on my ranch." "Mrs. Brooks is a thief and an arsonist who owes me compensation for damages. I've got legal documents right here." Victor patted his saddlebag, "proving her debt and my right to collect. Now, you can hand her over peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." "There's a third option," Daniel said calmly. "You leave now, file whatever legal papers you want through proper channels, and we handle this through territorial law instead of hired guns." Victor laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "You think I came all this way to play by rules written by fools? I make my own rules, Crow. Always have. And my rule says Eleanor belongs to me, along with those 3 little ones she's been hiding." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "You stay away from my children." "Your children?" Victor's scarred face twisted further. "Funny thing about debt, Eleanor. When you can't pay in cash, the law allows for alternative compensation. Those children could work off your debt in, 10 years or so. 15 maybe. Plenty of uses for young hands in my establishments." The threat was clear, deliberate, designed to provoke. Eleanor felt rage rise in her throat, but before she could respond, Daniel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You just made a fatal mistake, Hale." "Oh? And what's that?" "Threatening children on my land. That's not a debt dispute anymore. That's something else entirely." Daniel's hand moved to his gun, and around the yard his men did the same. "Last chance. Ride out now, or we settle this the frontier way." Victor's smile never wavered. "You're outnumbered, Crow. I've got 8 guns to your, 7? 8? And my men are professionals. Yours are just ranch hands playing at being soldiers. Your men are hired muscle who'll run the moment the shooting starts. Mine are defending their home. There's a difference. Then I guess we're about to find out which matters more, loyalty or skill." The moment stretched taut as wire. Eleanor could see Daniel calculating, weighing options, could see Victor's men shifting nervously, hands hovering near weapons, could see her entire fragile new life balanced on the edge of violence. Then hooves sounded from the road behind Victor's group, and a new voice cut through the standoff. "Federal Marshal coming through. Everyone keep their hands visible and their tempers cool." The marshal was a lean man in his 50s, weathered and sharp-eyed, with a badge pinned to his vest and a reputation that preceded him. Eleanor had heard Daniel mention Marshal Tom Bridger, a man who couldn't be bought and wouldn't be intimidated. Victor's expression flickered with annoyance. "Marshal, this is a private matter. Looked like a potential massacre from where I was riding." Bridger urged his horse forward, positioning himself between the 2 groups. "Daniel Crow, you care to explain why you've got armed men surrounding your ranch like you're expecting war?" "Protecting what's mine, Tom. Mr. Hale here seems to think he's got a right to take one of my employees by force." Bridger turned to Victor. "That true?" "I've got legitimate claims against Mrs. Brooks. Debts owed, crimes committed. I'm simply exercising my legal rights to collect." By riding onto private property with 8 armed men? That's not how legal rights work in my territory, Hale. Bridger's tone was mild, but there was steel underneath. You've got documents. Let's see them. Victor hesitated, clearly calculating whether cooperation or defiance served him better. Finally, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather folder, passing it to the marshal. Bridger read slowly, his expression unchanging. Eleanor watched, her heart hammering. She knew what those papers would say. Victor was meticulous about making his crimes look legal. Every debt inflated, every charge documented, everything designed to paint her as the villain. These papers say Mrs. Brooks owes you substantial money for rent, damages, and theft, Bridger finally said. They say she committed arson resulting in destruction of property. And they say you've got a warrant for her arrest issued in Colorado. Exactly, Sam. Exactly. So you'll be taking her into custody and transporting her back to Pueblo to face charges. Might if these papers were worth the ink they're printed on. Bridger folded the documents and handed them back. But there's a few problems. First, this warrant wasn't issued by any judge I recognize. Looks like you got some local justice of the peace to sign it, but that doesn't hold water across territorial lines. Second, your damage claims are civil matters, not criminal. And third, he paused, his gaze sharpening. I've got a telegram from the Pueblo marshal saying you're wanted for questioning regarding intimidation, extortion, and assault of a widow and her minor children. Victor's scarred face went rigid. That's a lie. Is it? Because according to my information, you've been running a protection racket disguised as legitimate business for the past 5 years, using debt to enslave women, using the law to legitimize your crimes. The only reason you haven't been arrested yet is because your political friends keep blocking the investigations. Bridger's voice hardened. But I don't have political friends, Hale. I have jurisdiction and a duty to enforce actual law, not the perverted version you've been peddling. You can't. I can, and I am. Here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to turn around and ride back to Colorado. If you've got legitimate claims against Mrs. Brooks, you file them through proper legal channels. Get a real warrant issued by a real judge with real evidence. Until then, she's under the protection of territorial law, and that means she stays right here unless and until a court says otherwise. Victor's hands tightened on his reins, knuckles white with rage. You're making a serious mistake, Marshal. The mistake was yours, coming onto Crow land with threats and guns. Now you've got a choice. Leave peaceful, or I arrest all 8 of you for trespassing, intimidation, and attempted kidnapping. What's it gonna be? For a long moment, Victor didn't move. His eyes found Eleanor again, and the hatred in them was palpable. This isn't over. It is for today, Bridger said flatly. Move out. Slowly, reluctantly, Victor wheeled his horse around. His men followed, but the scarred leader paused at the ridge to look back one final time. I'll see you hang, Eleanor, he called out. You and everyone who helped you. That's a promise. Then they were gone, dust rising in their wake. The silence that followed felt fragile, like glass under pressure. Eleanor realized she was still gripping the rifle hard enough to make her hands ache. She forced herself to set it down, to breathe, to process what had just happened. Daniel crossed the yard to shake Bridger's hand. Appreciate the timing, Tom. Wasn't timing. I've been tracking Hale since he crossed into New Mexico. Man like that leaves a trail of complaints wherever he goes. Bridger dismounted and accepted the cup of coffee Eleanor brought out with trembling hands. Mrs. Brooks, you're in a difficult position. I know, Marshal. Hale's not going to give up. He's the type who takes refusal as a personal insult. He'll keep coming until either he gets what he wants or someone stops him permanently. What are my options? Bridger sipped his coffee, considering. Legally? Not many. You did commit arson, even if it was self-defense. You did take money that wasn't technically yours, even if you were owed more. A good lawyer might get the charges reduced or dismissed, but that costs money you probably don't have and time Hale won't give you. So I keep running. Or you stand and fight. Make Hale come at you legally instead of with guns. Force him into a courtroom where his money and connections matter less. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's better than running for the rest of your life. Daniel spoke up. She's got support here, legal and otherwise. Whatever she needs to fight this proper. Bridger studied them both, his weathered face thoughtful. You two understand what you're getting into? Hale's connected, rich, mean. He'll use every dirty trick in the book, and he'll invent new ones. This could drag on for months, maybe years. Then it drags on, Daniel said simply. But it happens here, on my land, where Eleanor's got people standing with her. The marshal nodded slowly. All right then. I'll make some inquiries, see if I can find evidence of Hale's other crimes. If I can build a case against him, real charges, real evidence, then your situation becomes leverage instead of liability. Meanwhile, you keep your heads down and your guards up. Hale's not done, and next time he comes, it might not be with hired guns. Might be with lawyers or trumped-up charges or worse. We'll be ready, Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. After Bridger left, promising to return within the week with updates, the ranch slowly exhaled. The hands dispersed to their regular duties, though Eleanor noticed they kept their weapons closer than usual. Daniel walked her back to the cabin, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. You all right? He asked quietly. I saw his face. The burns. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. I did that to him. He did that to himself when he tried to assault you. Don't carry guilt for defending yourself and your children. But now he'll never stop. You saw his eyes. He's going to destroy me or die trying. Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. Then we make sure he's the one who dies. Eleanor's head snapped up. What? I'm not talking about murder. I'm talking about destroying him the way he's tried to destroy you, legally, publicly, permanently. Bridger's right. If we can expose Hale's crimes, build a case against him, we flip the script. Instead of you being the fugitive, he's the criminal. Instead of running from the law, you're helping it catch a predator. That's a nice idea, but Victor's spent years covering his tracks. He's got witnesses bought, records altered, officials in his pocket. In Colorado, maybe, but not here, and not everywhere. There've got to be other women like you, women he's exploited, threatened, abused. If we can find them, convince them to testify, they won't. They're too afraid. I was too afraid, until I had no choice left. Daniel's expression softened. Then we give them the same thing I'm giving you. Protection. Support. A place to stand that's safe enough to tell the truth. It's a long shot, Eleanor, but it's better than waiting for Hale to come back with something worse. Eleanor thought of Victor's scarred face, his promised revenge, the way he'd threatened her children. Thought of spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, teaching her children to live in fear, never knowing when the next attack would come. Daniel was right. Running hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. Maybe it was time to try something different. How do we start? She asked. We start by getting you proper legal representation. Then we start building a case, gathering evidence, finding witnesses. It'll take time and money and more courage than either of us probably has, but it's better than the alternative. Exactly. That evening, after the children were asleep and the ranch had settled into uneasy quiet, Eleanor sat at the small table in her cabin and wrote letters. To the marshal in Pueblo, offering to testify against Victor if charges were filed. To the lawyer Daniel had recommended in Santa Fe, requesting consultation. To two women she'd known in Colorado, women who'd worked for Victor and suffered under his control, asking if they'd be willing to speak up if promises of protection could be guaranteed. She didn't know if the letters would do any good, didn't know if anyone would respond, or if the law would care about the suffering of women whose society had already dismissed as disposable. But she wrote them anyway, because the alternative was surrender, and Eleanor Brooks had already decided she was done surrendering. 3 days later, a young ranch hand rode in from town with a telegram. Daniel read it, his expression darkening, then brought it to Eleanor in the kitchen. The message was brief. Fire at Bent Creek Hotel. 2 dead. Marshal Bridger investigating. Hale seen in area. Stay alert. Eleanor's hands began to shake. He's sending a message. Yes. People are dying because of me. People are dying because Victor Hale is a murderous bastard who uses violence to maintain control. Daniel's voice was hard. Don't take responsibility for his choices. But Eleanor couldn't help it. 2 people dead? And for what? To prove Victor could reach them even here? To demonstrate that nowhere was safe? That night, she didn't sleep, paced the cabin while her children slumbered, unaware of the fresh blood spilled in their name, checked the windows compulsively, expecting to see fire on the horizon or armed men approaching through the darkness. Instead, as dawn broke gray and cold, she saw something else. Daniel, standing between the cabin and the main house, rifle across his chest, keeping watch. He'd been there all night, she realized, standing guard while she paced and worried and fought with fear. When he saw her emerge, he nodded once. No words needed. Just acknowledgement of shared purpose, shared danger, shared determination not to let the monster win. Eleanor walked to the main house and started breakfast, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind worked through impossible calculations. How to keep her children safe. How to fight a man with unlimited resources and no conscience. How to survive when every move seemed to trigger fresh violence. The hands filed in at 6, grim-faced but resolute. They'd all heard about the fire. All understood the implications, but not one of them suggested leaving or abandoning the fight. "We stand with you, Mrs. Brooks," Hank said quietly as she poured his coffee. "All of us. Whatever comes." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why risk your lives for someone you barely know?" The old cowboy smiled, weathered face creasing. "Because some things are worth fighting for. Because we've all seen men like Hale take and take and take, and we're tired of watching it happen. And because," he glanced at Daniel, "because the boss believes in you, and we believe in him. That's reason enough." After breakfast, Daniel called them all together in the barn. 10 men, counting himself. Not a large force, but dedicated, loyal, ready. "Here's the situation," Daniel began, his voice carrying in the quiet space. "Victor Hale is escalating. The fire in town was a warning. Next time, he'll come directly at us. We need to be prepared for anything. Arson, ambush, legal maneuvering, false charges. He's got resources we don't have, but we've got something he doesn't. We've got righteousness on our side, and we've got each other." "What's the plan, boss?" asked Billy, the youngest hand. "We fortify. 2 men on watch at all times, rotating shifts. We keep weapons close and eyes open. No one goes into town alone. Mrs. Brooks and her children stay on ranch property unless I'm personally escorting them. We document everything, every threat, every incident, every piece of evidence that hails the aggressor here. And we wait for Marshal Bridger to build his case while making damn sure we're still alive when it's time to testify. And if Hale attacks before the law catches up?" This from Miguel, a quiet Mexican hand who'd worked the ranch for 3 years. Daniel's expression hardened. "Then we defend what's ours with everything we've got. I'm not asking any of you to die for this. If it gets too hot, you're free to ride out with full pay and no hard feelings. But if you stay, I need to know you're in this completely." Silence fell. Then, one by one, each man nodded. "All in, boss," Hank said, speaking for all of them. Eleanor, watching from the barn door, felt something shift in her chest. These men didn't know her story, didn't know if she was innocent or guilty, righteous or flawed. But they stood with her anyway, because Daniel Crow had decided she was worth defending, and that was enough. She thought of Victor's burned face, his promised revenge, his casual threat against her children, thought of all the ways this could end badly, violence, death, destruction. But she also thought of Thomas, working alongside these men with growing confidence, thought of Sarah, who'd laughed yesterday for the first time in months, thought of James, who'd stopped flinching every time a stranger appeared. Her children were learning what it meant to have people stand with you, learning that running wasn't the only option, learning that sometimes the right thing to do was plant your feet and refuse to be moved. Whatever happened next, whatever Victor brought to their doorstep, Eleanor knew they'd face it together. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to survive. The attack came on a moonless Thursday night, 3 weeks after Victor's first appearance at the ranch. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke. For a disorienting moment, she was back in Colorado, oil flames spreading across wooden floors while Victor screamed and her children cried. Then consciousness slammed into place, and she understood. This wasn't memory. This was happening now. She rolled out of bed, her hand automatically reaching for the rifle she'd started keeping propped against the wall. Through the cabin window, she could see orange light flickering near the barn. Not the barn itself, the hay shed beside it, flames already climbing the dry wood with hungry eagerness. "Thomas, get your brother and sister, now!" Her voice was sharp but controlled, cutting through the children's confused stirring. Just like we practiced. Thomas was 12 years old and had become an expert at moving fast in the dark. Within seconds, he had James by one hand and Sarah by the other, both younger children still stumbling with sleep but obedient through long training. "Out the back, toward the main house," Eleanor commanded. "Stay low and run." She followed them out, rifle ready, scanning the darkness for movement. The ranch was erupting into chaos, men shouting, running toward the fire with buckets, more flames suddenly springing to life near the bunkhouse. Daniel's voice cut through the confusion, directing the hands to form a bucket line from the well. Eleanor got her children to the main house kitchen and pushed them under the heavy wooden table. "Stay here. Don't come out until I say." "Mama," Sarah's voice was thin with terror. "I'll be right back, baby. I promise." Eleanor kissed her daughter's forehead, then turned and ran back outside. The hay shed was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the night sky. But it was the bunkhouse fire that worried her more. If it spread to where the men slept, they'd lose not just supplies but lives. She joined the bucket line, passing water with burning arms while smoke stung her eyes. "It's deliberate," Hank gasped beside her, his weathered face streaked with soot. 3 separate fires, all started at the same time. Someone's still out there. "Where's Daniel?" "Went after them, saw movement near the corral and took Miguel with him." Eleanor's stomach clenched. Victor wouldn't send amateurs for this. He'd send killers. Men who knew how to fight in the dark, how to use chaos as cover. If Daniel ran into them unprepared... A gunshot cracked through the night, sharp and distinct above the roar of flames. Eleanor's hands froze on the bucket. Around her, the ranch hands hesitated, torn between fighting the fire and running toward the sound of violence. Another shot answered the first, then a rapid exchange that sounded like multiple weapons. "Keep the line going," Eleanor ordered, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "We lose these buildings. We lose everything. The boss can handle himself." She didn't know if that was true, but she knew panic would kill them faster than fire or bullets. The men responded to her certainty, returning to their desperate work. The bunkhouse fire was contained first, stamped out before it could reach the sleeping quarters. The hay shed was a loss, but the barn itself remained untouched. By the time Daniel and Miguel emerged from the darkness, clothes torn and faces grim, the immediate danger had passed. Daniel was limping slightly, and Miguel had blood running down his left arm, but both were alive. "Got one of them," Daniel said without preamble. "Dead. The other 2 ran when they realized we were shooting back. Found evidence they'd been preparing to torch the main house next." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. The main house, where she'd hidden her children. Daniel saw her expression and shook his head quickly. "They didn't get that far. We stopped them in time." "Who were they?" "Hired guns out of Denver. Professional arsonists from the look of their equipment." Daniel spat into the dirt, his anger barely contained. "Hale's not even trying to hide it anymore. This was meant to burn us out completely." Marshal Bridger arrived at dawn, riding hard from town with 2 deputies. He surveyed the damage with the weary expression of a man who'd seen too much human cruelty and still found new depths to surprise him. "The dead man's name is Jack Sutter," Bridger said after examining the body. "Known associate of Victor Hale. Arrested twice for arson in Colorado, walked both times because witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. This ties directly back to Hale." "Can you arrest him?" Eleanor asked. She'd emerged from the main house once the sun rose, leaving her exhausted children sleeping under heavy quilts while she faced the reality of what had almost happened. "On what charge? Sutter's dead, can't testify. The other 2 got away. And unless we can prove Hale directly ordered this, which he's too smart to put in writing, it's just circumstantial. So he gets away with it again." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "Not necessarily." Bridger pulled out a folded paper from his coat. "I've been doing some digging like I promised. Found 3 women in Colorado willing to testify about Hale's methods. Coercion, debt manipulation, physical threats. And I found something else. Financial records showing Hale's been running a fraud scheme, through his various businesses, inflating debts, forging documents, bribing officials. It's not murder, but it's enough to get a grand jury interested. Daniel straightened despite his obvious exhaustion. How long until you can bring charges? 2 weeks, maybe 3. I need to get the witnesses to Santa Fe, coordinate with the territorial prosecutor, make sure everything's airtight. Hale's got lawyers who'll tear apart anything less than perfect. Bridger's gaze moved between Daniel and Eleanor. Question is, can you last that long? Because after last night, Hale knows you're dug in. He's going to escalate further. We'll last, Daniel said flatly. Whatever it takes. After Bridger left, promising to station a deputy in Bent Creek to watch for Hale's movements, Daniel called another meeting in the barn. The hands gathered, smoke-stained and exhausted, several sporting minor burns and injuries from the night's chaos. I'm giving each of you a choice, Daniel began. You can stay and see this through, or you can take 3 months' wages and ride out with my blessing and my thanks. What happened last night, that's just the beginning. Hale's going to keep coming until either we're destroyed or he is. I won't blame any man for deciding that's not his fight. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for the inevitable defections. These were working men, not soldiers. They had no obligation to die for someone else's battle. Then Hank stepped forward. Been thinking about this since last night, boss. And here's what I figured. I'm 63 years old, worked ranches from Texas to Montana. Seen a lot of men like Victor Hale take what they want and call it business. Never once saw anyone stand up to them the way you're doing. He paused, his weathered face set with determination. I'm too old to start being a coward now. I'm staying. Miguel nodded. My sister, she worked for a man like Hale in Chihuahua. He destroyed her. I stay and I fight. One by one, every hand committed to staying. Even Billy, young and scared but trying to hide it, squared his shoulders and said he wasn't going anywhere. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. These men barely knew her, yet they were willing to risk everything because Daniel Crow had declared her worth protecting. The weight of that responsibility settled over her like physical pressure. Thank you, she said quietly. All of you. I know what you're risking, and I— Don't thank us yet, Hank interrupted with a grim smile. Save it for when we're all still breathing at the end. The next 2 weeks passed in a state of controlled tension. Daniel organized the ranch like a military outpost, guards rotating in shifts, weapons always within reach, no one traveling alone. Eleanor moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, cooking meals and cleaning house while part of her mind stayed constantly alert for the next attack. The children felt it too. Sarah stopped laughing. James grew quiet and watchful. Thomas took to sleeping with a knife under his pillow, and Eleanor didn't have the heart to tell him it wouldn't help if armed men came for them in the night. Letters arrived, responses to the ones Eleanor had sent weeks ago. The lawyer in Santa Fe agreed to take her case, intrigued by the challenge of exposing a powerful criminal and willing to work for reduced fees given the circumstances. One of the women from Colorado wrote back, her words shaky but determined. If you're really going to fight him, I'll stand with you. Someone has to. It wasn't much, but it was something. Small pieces of hope in an otherwise dark time. Then, on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. Daniel was in town collecting supplies when the rider came. Eleanor was in the garden behind the cabin, teaching Sarah how to identify edible plants, when she heard hooves approaching fast. Thomas appeared from the barn, already running toward the house. Mama, someone's coming! Eleanor grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. They made it to the porch as the rider pulled up. A young Mexican boy, maybe 14, his horse lathered with sweat. Senora Brooks? He gasped. I have message from Senor Crow. He says you must come to town now. Very important. Marshall needs you. Eleanor's instincts screamed warning. Why didn't Daniel come himself? He is with the marshal. They have Victor Hale arrested. They need you to identify him, make statement for charges. It was exactly what they'd been waiting for. The moment when all their patience and suffering might finally pay off. But something felt wrong. The timing too convenient, the messenger too young and unknown. Who sent you? Eleanor asked carefully. Senor Crow. I work at the stable in town. He gave me $2 to ride fast and bring you. Hank had appeared from the barn, rifle in hand. "Don't like this, Mrs. Brooks. Could be a trap. Or it could be real," Eleanor countered. "If they really have Victor in custody, I need to be there to make sure the charges stick. Then we all go. Safety in numbers." But Eleanor shook her head. "If it is a trap, I won't lead everyone into it. And if it's real, I can't leave the ranch completely undefended." She thought quickly, weighing risks against potential rewards. "Hank, you come with me. Miguel, you're in charge here. No one leaves. No one comes onto the property without challenge. Thomas, I'm coming too," her son said, his jaw set with determination that reminded her painfully of his father. "Thomas, no. If they have Victor, I want to see him in chains. I want him to know he didn't win." The boy's voice cracked. "Please, Mama, I need this." Eleanor looked at her son, 12 years old and carrying burdens no child should bear, and understood. He needed to see the monster defeated, needed proof that standing and fighting had been worth it. "All right," she said quietly, "but you stay close to me. No matter what happens, you don't leave my side." They rode out within 15 minutes, Eleanor and Thomas in the wagon with Hank riding alongside, his rifle across his saddle. The journey to Bent Creek took an hour, and with every passing minute, Eleanor's sense of wrongness grew stronger. The town appeared quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. The streets were nearly empty despite the midday hour, and the few people visible hurried about their business without meeting Eleanor's eyes. "Where's the marshal's office?" Eleanor asked the young messenger. "This way, Senora, follow me." He led them down the main street toward a building at the far end. Hank's hand moved to his rifle, and Eleanor felt her own fingers tighten on the reins. The marshal's office should have been in the center of town, not isolated at the edge. "Hold up," Hank said suddenly. "That's not the marshal's office. That's the old land office. Been closed for months." The boy's expression flickered, just for a moment, but long enough to confirm Eleanor's worst fears. "Run!" she screamed, yanking the reins to turn the wagon. Gunfire erupted from the buildings on either side. Hank's horse went down with a scream, the old cowboy rolling clear but his rifle falling into the dirt. Eleanor slapped the reins hard, urging their horse into a panicked gallop, while Thomas clung to the seat beside her. More shots. Something whistled past Eleanor's ear. Behind them, she could hear Hank returning fire, his pistol cracking sharp reports. The wagon careened around a corner, nearly overturning, and Eleanor fought to keep it upright while steering with one hand and reaching for the rifle beside her with the other. "There's the real marshal's office!" Thomas pointed ahead to a building with Bridger's horse tied outside. Eleanor aimed the wagon directly at it, praying the marshal was actually inside and not part of whatever trap Victor had laid. They pulled up hard, the wagon skidding in the dirt, and Eleanor grabbed Thomas and practically threw him toward the office door. "Marshal Bridger!" she screamed. "Ambush!" The door burst open and Bridger appeared, gun already drawn, his deputies behind him. He took in the situation instantly. The wagon, the distant gunfire, Eleanor's terrified expression. "Inside, both of you. Now!" He pushed them through the door while his deputies took positions at the windows. "What happened?" Eleanor explained in gasping bursts while Thomas clung to her side, his face white with shock. Bridger's expression grew darker with every word. "Hale's not here," he said grimly. "Never was. This was a setup to draw you out where he could take you without assaulting the ranch directly. Hank's still out there. He's alone." "Sam, go get Hank if he's still breathing," Bridger ordered one deputy. "Take the back way and come around from the alley. You see anyone who's not Hank, you shoot first and question later." He turned back to Eleanor. "How many attackers?" "I don't know, 4, 5? They were in the buildings on—" Gunfire erupted again, closer now. Through the window, Eleanor could see men advancing down the street, not even bothering to hide anymore. 6 of them, moving with the confidence of professionals who knew their targets were trapped. "That's more than just hired guns," Bridger muttered. "That's a small army." "Victor's not subtle when he's angry," Eleanor said, surprised her voice worked at all. The marshal checked his ammunition, his face set in grim lines. "We've got maybe 20 rounds between us. They'll have more. And they're not worried about the law because Hale's probably paying off half the territory by now. So what do? We hold them off until reinforcements arrive. I sent a runner to the ranch soon as I heard gunfire. If Daniel gets here fast enough—" "The ranch," Eleanor breathed, horror flooding through her. "Thomas came with me. If this was to draw us away—" She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Bridger's expression told her he'd reached the same terrible conclusion. While Eleanor and the strongest defenders were in town, the ranch stood vulnerable. Sarah and James were there with only a skeleton crew for protection. If Victor had planned this carefully, and he always planned carefully, then the ambush in town was only half the strategy. The other half was happening right now, miles away, to her two youngest children. Eleanor felt her knees buckle. Thomas caught her, his young arms surprisingly strong, his voice fierce in her ear. "They're safe, Mama. Miguel and the others won't let anything happen to them." But Miguel and the others were outnumbered and outgunned if Victor had sent his full force against the ranch. And Eleanor had walked right into the trap, had brought her oldest son with her, had left her babies defended by good men who might not be enough. "I have to get back there," she said, pulling away from Thomas and reaching for the door. Bridger blocked her path. "You go out there now, you die. And dead mothers don't protect anyone." "My children are with trained men who know how to defend a position. You trained them yourself, you said. They know to hide, stay quiet, wait for help. Trust that." His voice softened slightly. "But we need to end this here first. If we can capture even one of Hale's men, get him to testify, we might have enough to put Hale away permanently. And that's the only way your children will ever truly be safe." Eleanor wanted to scream, to fight, to run through a hail of bullets if it meant reaching Sarah and James. But Bridger was right. The only way to end this was to destroy Victor completely, and that meant making smart choices instead of desperate ones. The gunfire outside intensified. Through the window, she could see Hank being dragged into the alley by Bridger's deputy, the old cowboy's leg bleeding, but his eyes still fierce and alert. At least he was alive. The attackers were getting bolder, moving from building to building, surrounding the marshal's office with practiced efficiency. These weren't just hired guns, this was a coordinated assault by men who knew what they were doing. "How long until Daniel gets here?" Thomas asked, his voice remarkably steady for a terrified 12-year-old. "Depends on how fast he rides and whether he runs into trouble on the way," Bridger said. "Could be 20 minutes, could be an hour." "We don't have an hour," Satish Eleanor said, watching the approaching men. "They'll breach this building in 10 minutes, maybe less." "Then we make those 10 minutes count." Bridger handed her a pistol. "You know how to use this?" "My father taught me." "Good. You watch the back door. Anything comes through that's not wearing a badge, you shoot it. Tom, you stay low and reload for whoever needs it. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded, his young face set with determination that broke Eleanor's heart. The first assault came 3 minutes later. 2 men rushed the front door while another smashed through a side window. Bridger shot the first one before he'd fully entered. His deputy got the second. The one through the window made it inside, glass crunching under his boots, before Eleanor's shot took him in the shoulder and spun him around into the deputy's follow-up. The gun smoke was thick, acrid, burning Eleanor's lungs. Her hands shook, but her aim held. Thomas moved between them, gathering spent shells and pressing fresh ammunition into their hands with fingers that trembled but never fumbled. "They're regrouping," Bridger said, peering through the shattered window. "Next wave will be bigger." Eleanor's mind raced through impossible calculations. They were outnumbered, low on ammunition, trapped in a building with limited cover. Even if Daniel arrived, he'd be riding into a crossfire. Even if they somehow survived the next assault, the ranch might already be lost. Unless she changed the equation. "I'm going out there," Eleanor said suddenly. "Like hell you are." "Listen to me. They want me, not you. Victor sent all these men to take me alive. If I surrender, he'll kill you the moment he has you." "Maybe. Or maybe he'll keep me alive long enough to gloat. Victor's weakness is his pride. He needs to win, needs to see me broken, needs everyone to know he crushed the woman who defied him." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as the plan crystallized. "If I go out there, draw them away from this building, you and your deputies can hit them from behind, and Daniel can reach the ranch without being ambushed on the road. That's suicide. That's strategy." Eleanor checked the pistol's load. "And it's the only play we have left." Thomas grabbed her arm, his grip desperate. "Mama, no, you can't. I can, and I will." Because Sarah and James need their mother alive, and the only way I stay alive is if Victor Hale is either dead or in custody. This is how we make that happen." She cupped her son's face, memorizing the features that reminded her so much of his father. "You stay here with the marshal, stay safe, and if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." Eleanor smiled, though it felt like her face might crack. "If something happens, you take care of your brother and sister. You're strong enough. I've watched you become strong enough." Before Bridger could stop her, before Thomas could protest further, before her own courage could fail, Eleanor Brooks opened the front door and stepped out into the street with her hands raised above her head. "Victor Hale!" she called out, her voice carrying through the smoke and chaos. "I know you're watching. I know what you want. So let's end this, you and me, face to face, like you've been promising for 4 months." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the building across the street, scarred face twisted into a smile of terrible satisfaction. "Well, Eleanor," Victor Hale said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of charm and cruelty, "I was hoping you'd see sense, though I expected you to last longer before you broke." "I'm not broken. I'm making a trade, me for everyone else. Let the marshal and his men leave. Let my son leave. And I'll come with you quietly." Victor laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "You're in no position to negotiate terms, darling, but I admire the attempt." He gestured, and 2 of his men moved forward, guns trained on Eleanor. "Take her, and kill anyone who follows." The men reached for her, rough hands grabbing her arms. Eleanor didn't resist, but her eyes stayed locked on Victor's scarred face. Somewhere behind her, she heard Thomas scream her name, heard Bridger cursing, heard the beginning of what sounded like horses approaching fast from the edge of town. But her attention stayed on Victor and the small Derringer pistol she'd palmed from her sleeve before raising her hands. She'd learned a lot in 4 months of running, learned how to hide, how to lie, how to survive against impossible odds. And she'd learned that sometimes the only way to kill a monster was to get close enough to look it in the eyes. Victor saw the gun the same moment Eleanor raised it. His expression shifted from triumph to shock to rage in the space of a heartbeat. Eleanor pulled the trigger. The shot took Victor high in the chest, punching him backward. His men froze in confusion, and that moment of hesitation was all Bridger needed. The marshal and his deputies burst from the office, guns blazing, catching the attackers in a crossfire they never expected. And from the other end of town came Daniel Crow, with every ranch hand he could gather, riding hard and shooting straight, surrounding Victor's remaining men with the fury of people defending their own. Eleanor stood in the middle of the chaos, the Derringer smoking in her hand, watching Victor Hale collapse into the dirt of a New Mexico street, his blood mixing with the dust he'd traveled so far to claim her on. It wasn't over yet. Men were still shooting, still fighting, still dying in the street around her. But Eleanor Brooks had finally stopped running. And in stopping, she'd found something she thought she'd lost forever, the strength to fight back. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind only smoke and the groans of wounded men scattered across the street. Eleanor stood frozen, the Derringer still clutched in her hand, watching Victor Hale writhe in the dirt. Blood bloomed across his chest, dark and spreading, but he was still alive, still conscious, still looking at her with eyes that burned with hatred and disbelief. "You shot me," he gasped, the words bubbling with blood. "You actually shot me." "I did." Eleanor's voice was steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "And I'd do it again." Daniel reached her first, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. His hands gripped her shoulders, his eyes scanning her frantically for injuries. "Eleanor, are you hurt? Did they—" "I'm fine." She looked past him to where Bridger and his deputies were rounding up the surviving attackers. "The children, the ranch, safe. Miguel sent one of the boys to warn me when riders approached the property. They barricaded themselves in the root cellar with Sarah and James. No one got through." Daniel's grip tightened. "But you, what were you thinking walking out there like that? You could have been killed." "I was thinking that hiding wasn't working anymore, that running wasn't working, that the only way to end this was to face it head on." Eleanor finally looked at him, seeing the fear and fury warring in his expression. "I was thinking that sometimes you have to risk everything to protect what matters most." Before Daniel could respond, Bridger approached, his weathered face grim. "Mrs. Brooks, I need that weapon." Eleanor handed over the derringer without argument. "It's mine. My father gave it to me years ago. I've carried it hidden since Colorado." "I figured, though I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, since by rights you should have declared any weapons you carried into town." Bridger's expression softened slightly. "But given that you just saved all our lives and potentially ended one of the territory's most persistent criminals, I'm inclined toward gratitude rather than enforcement." "Is he going to die?" Eleanor asked, looking back at Victor. A doctor had arrived and was working on him with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew the patient probably wouldn't survive but had to try anyway. "Hard to say. You hit him high and right, missed the heart but got the lung. He might make it if he's lucky and the doctor's skilled." Bridger studied her face. "How do you feel about that?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I wanted him stopped. If that means dead, then dead. If it means alive to stand trial and face justice for everything he's done, that's fine too. I just want him to never hurt anyone again." "Fair enough." The marshal turned to his deputies. "Get these men secured and counted. I want names, statements, everything we need to connect them directly to Hale. And somebody ride to Santa Fe. We need a prosecutor here by tomorrow." Thomas appeared at Eleanor's side, his face still pale, but his eyes fierce with pride and relief. "You were amazing, Mama." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted, pulling her son close. "But sometimes you do the terrifying thing anyway because it's the only option left." "Did you plan it? The hidden gun?" "I hoped I wouldn't need it. But yes, I planned it. Victor's weakness was always his pride, his need to see me broken and humiliated before he finished me. I counted on him wanting to gloat long enough for me to get close." She smoothed Thomas's hair, the gesture automatic and grounding. "Never count on a monster's mercy, but you can usually count on their ego." Hank limped over, his leg bandaged, but his expression pleased. "Well, Mrs. Brooks, that was the damnedest thing I've seen in 63 years. Walked right into this devil's mouth and shot your way back out." "I had good people watching my back." "That you did. And speaking of which," Hank nodded toward the edge of town where riders were approaching. "Looks like the rest of the ranch is arriving." Miguel led the group, his face tight with concern until he spotted Eleanor standing upright and unharmed. Behind him rode Billy and the other hands, and in a wagon at the rear, Eleanor could see Sarah and James peeking over the sides with wide, frightened eyes. She ran to them, Daniel and Thomas beside her, and pulled her two youngest into her arms with a fierceness that made them squeak in protest. "You're safe, you're both safe." "We hid like you taught us," Sarah whispered. "We were so quiet, Mama, even when we heard the bad men." "I knew you would be. You were so brave." Eleanor kissed both their heads, breathing in the familiar scent of her children and letting it ground her in the moment. Her family was whole, alive, together. Daniel's hand settled on her shoulder, solid and reassuring. Around them, the ranch hands were dismounting, checking on their injured, securing the perimeter with the practiced efficiency of men who'd learned to expect trouble. The town of Bent Creek was slowly emerging from hiding, curious faces peering from doorways and windows at the aftermath of violence in their streets. And in the center of it all lay Victor Hale, still breathing but broken, his reign of terror ended by the woman he'd tried to destroy. Victor survived. The bullet had collapsed his lung and shattered a rib, but the doctor's skill and Victor's own stubborn refusal to die kept him alive through the night and into the next week. By the time the territorial prosecutor arrived from Santa Fe, Victor was conscious enough to understand the charges being read against him: extortion, fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, arson. And those were just the charges that could be proven immediately. As word spread that Victor Hale had finally been brought down, other victims began to emerge. Women who'd been too afraid to speak before found courage in Eleanor's example. Business owners he'd ruined came forward with evidence. Even some of the officials he'd bribed turned on him, seeking leniency in exchange for testimony. The case was ironclad. Victor Hale would spend whatever remained of his life in territorial prison, and if the federal prosecutors got involved, which seemed likely given the scope of his crimes, he might hang after all. Eleanor testified at the preliminary hearing, her voice steady as she recounted every detail of Victor's abuse, his threats, his systematic destruction of anyone who opposed him. Thomas sat beside her, and when the prosecutor asked if she'd been afraid when she shot Victor, Eleanor looked directly at the man who'd terrorized her for so long. "No," she said clearly. "I wasn't afraid anymore. I was done letting him make me afraid." Victor's lawyer tried to paint her as a vengeful woman who'd attacked an innocent businessman, but the parade of witnesses who followed destroyed that narrative. By the third day of testimony, even the lawyer looked convinced of his client's guilt. The judge, a steel-haired woman named Margaret Carson, who'd presided over territorial cases for 20 years, set bail at an amount Victor couldn't possibly make while hospitalized and under guard. He would await trial in custody, and given the evidence, the trial was expected to be brief and conclusive. It was over. Really, truly over. Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps afterward, surrounded by her children and the men who'd risked everything to protect them, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 months. Peace. "What happens now?" Thomas asked as they prepared to ride back to the ranch. Eleanor looked at Daniel, who'd stood beside her through every moment of the hearing, solid and unwavering. "Now we go home." The word felt strange on her tongue. Home. Not a temporary shelter or a place to hide, but an actual home. The Crow Ranch had become that without her quite realizing when it happened. Somewhere between learning to trust Daniel's protection and watching her children bloom under the care of good men who treated them with dignity. "Home sounds good," Daniel said quietly, and the way he looked at her suggested he meant more than just the physical place. The ride back to the ranch was different from every journey Eleanor had made in the past 4 months. There was no looking over her shoulder, no calculating escape routes, no tense readiness for the next disaster, just the steady rhythm of horses' hooves, the warm New Mexico sun, and the sound of her children talking and laughing without fear. When they crested the ridge and saw the ranch spread out below, the repaired hay shed, the barn standing strong, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, Eleanor felt something break open in her chest. Not painfully, but like a dam releasing pressure she'd held too long. She was crying before she realized it, tears streaming down her face in a way she'd forbidden herself since Colorado. Thomas reached over from his horse to squeeze her hand. Sarah and James, riding in the wagon with Miguel, called out questions about why Mama was sad. "Not sad, babies," Eleanor managed. "Happy. These are happy tears." And they were. Relief and gratitude and exhaustion and hope all mixed together, pouring out in salt water and shaking shoulders while Daniel rode close enough that their knees brushed. His presence a silent reminder that she didn't have to carry anything alone anymore. That evening, after the children were fed and settled and the ranch had returned to its normal rhythms, Eleanor found Daniel in the barn. He was checking on the mare who'd been limping, his movements gentle and practiced. "She's going to be fine," he said without looking up. "Just a stone bruise, few days of rest, and she'll be back to normal." "Daniel?" Eleanor waited until he turned to face her. "I need to tell you something." "All right." "When I came here, I was planning to stay just long enough to save some money and move on. I never intended to put down roots, never intended to involve you or your men in my problems, never intended—" She stopped, gathering courage. "Never intended to start caring about someone again." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "And now? Now I realize I've been given something I didn't think I'd ever have. A second chance. Not just at survival, but at living. At building something real." Eleanor stepped closer, her heart hammering. "You gave me that. You and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to let me keep running. You stood between me and a monster, and you never asked for anything in return. I didn't do it for reward, Eleanor. I know. You did it because it was right, because you're a good man who couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer." She reached for his hand, calloused and strong. "But I want you to know, I see you. Not just the rancher who gave me a job, not just the protector who kept my children safe. I see the man who's been grieving his wife and daughter for 2 years, the man who's been half alive, going through motions, surviving but not living." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "Eleanor, I'm not Sarah. I'll never be her, and I'm not trying to replace what you lost. But I think, she took a shaky breath, I think maybe we could both stop just surviving. Maybe we could figure out how to live again, together. For a long moment, Daniel didn't speak. Then he raised his free hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I loved my wife, he said quietly. Loved her with everything I had. When she died, I thought that part of me died too. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life working this ranch and waiting to join her. His eyes searched Eleanor's face. Then you showed up with your secrets and your children and your fierce determination to protect them at any cost. And slowly, so slowly I didn't even notice it happening, you reminded me what it felt like to care about tomorrow instead of just enduring it. Is that a yes? Eleanor whispered. That's a yes. To living instead of surviving. To building something together. To seeing where this goes without running from it. Daniel smiled, and it transformed his face from severe to almost boyish. To home. Eleanor stretched up and kissed him, soft and tentative, testing this new territory between them. Daniel responded with careful tenderness, his hands gentle on her waist, his lips warm against hers. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Eleanor laughed. The children are going to have opinions about this. Thomas already asked me last week if I had intentions toward his mother. He did not. He did. Very seriously. Said he approved as long as I promised to treat you with respect and never make you cry. Daniel's expression grew fond. That boy's going to be something special when he grows up. They all will. They already are. And they're going to need a good man in their lives. Someone to teach Thomas how to run a ranch properly. Someone to show James how to be gentle and strong at the same time. Someone to make Sarah feel safe enough to laugh again. I can do that. Want to do that. Daniel pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head. Fair warning, though. I'm not perfect. I'm moody sometimes. I work too hard. I'm not always good with words. I've been running from a monster for 4 months. I've got 3 children to raise and trauma to heal from. I'm stubborn and independent, and I'll probably argue with you about everything. Eleanor smiled against his chest. Sounds like we're well matched. Sounds like it. They stood together in the quiet barn, holding each other while the ranch settled into evening around them. Through the open door, Eleanor could see lights coming on in the cabin where her children were probably getting ready for bed. Could see Hank and Miguel sharing coffee on the bunkhouse steps. Could see the land spreading out under a darkening sky, solid and permanent in theirs. This was what she'd been running toward without knowing it. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. The next weeks passed in a blur of normalcy that felt almost surreal after months of constant crisis. Eleanor cooked and cleaned and cared for the house. Thomas worked alongside the ranch hands, learning everything Daniel could teach him. Sarah started attending the small school in Bent Creek, riding in with one of the hands each morning and coming home full of stories. James discovered a talent for gentling horses and spent hours in the corral with Daniel, his small hands learning patience and care. And slowly, carefully, Eleanor and Daniel built something between them. Not rushed or desperate, but steady. Conversations over morning coffee, shared glances across the dinner table, moments in the evening when they'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset while the children played in the yard. The town of Bent Creek gradually accepted Eleanor as one of their own. The women who'd initially been suspicious warmed when they realized she wasn't trying to cause scandal or steal husbands. The men respected her for standing up to Victor Hale when most would have crumbled, and the children simply accepted her kids as playmates without caring about the complicated history that had brought them here. Marshal Bridger visited regularly, updating them on Victor's case. The trial was set for September, and the prosecutor was confident in a conviction. Several of Victor's associates had already pleaded guilty in exchange for testimony against him. The financial records showed fraud on a massive scale. Even Victor's expensive lawyers couldn't spin the evidence into anything resembling innocence. He's going to prison for the rest of his life, Bridger told Eleanor one afternoon. Probably federal prison, given the scope of his crimes. He'll never walk free again. Good, Eleanor said simply. How do you feel about that? Eleanor considered the question. A few months ago, she'd have said she wanted Victor dead, wanted him to suffer the way he'd made others suffer. But now, with distance and safety and the beginnings of healing, she felt something different. I feel relieved, she said finally, not vindictive or triumphant, just relieved that he can't hurt anyone else, that other women won't go through what I did, that my children can grow up without fear. She looked at the marshal. Is that strange? No, ma'am, that's healthy. Revenge is a poison. You're choosing something better. Bridger stood to leave, settling his hat. For what it's worth, you did a brave thing. Not just shooting him, but everything that came before. Running to protect your children. Refusing to give up or give in. Finding the strength to stand still and fight. That took real courage. After he left, Eleanor sat on the porch and thought about courage. About all the small acts of bravery that had brought her to this moment. Leaving Colorado with nothing but 3 children and desperate hope. Taking a job from a stranger. Choosing to trust Daniel. Standing in a dusty street with a hidden gun and a heart full of terror, betting everything on one desperate play. She'd been so afraid. Still was sometimes when nightmares woke her in the dark hours. But fear hadn't stopped her. Hadn't broken her. Hadn't won. That evening, Daniel found her lost in thought and sat beside her without speaking. Just his presence, solid and comforting, reminding her she wasn't alone anymore. I've been thinking, he said eventually, about the future. Oh. Thomas is going to need more than ranch work. He's smart, Eleanor. Should probably go to school, maybe even university eventually. Eleanor's throat tightened. That costs money we don't have. We could have it, if we make this official. Daniel turned to face her. Marry me, Eleanor. Not because you owe me or because the children need a father, though they do, and I'd be honored to fill that role. Marry me because I love you. Because somewhere between hiring a cook and nearly dying to protect her, I fell completely in love with you. Eleanor stared at him, her heart racing. Daniel! I know it's fast. I know you're still healing. I know there are 1,000 reasons to wait or say no. But I also know that life's too short to waste time being cautious when you found something worth fighting for. And you're worth fighting for, Eleanor Brooks. I can't give you more children, Eleanor said, the words rushing out. The doctor said after James, there were complications. I don't need more children. I need you. And the 3 you already have, they're more than enough. They're perfect. Daniel took her hands. Say yes. Not because it's practical or safe or makes sense. Say yes because you want to. Because this, us, feels right. Eleanor looked at this man who'd defended her when he had no reason to, who'd stood between her and destruction, who'd opened his home and his heart to her broken family. Thought about the life they could build together, the healing they could find, the love that had grown from crisis and courage into something real and lasting. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Daniel's smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious face into something joyful and young. He kissed her there on the porch as the sun set over the New Mexico territory, and Eleanor felt the last pieces of her shattered life click into place. They were married in early August, in a simple ceremony at the church in Bent Creek. Eleanor wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Daniel had bought her as an early wedding gift. Thomas stood proud as her witness, James and Sarah scattering wildflowers they'd gathered from the meadow. The ranch hands attended in their Sunday best, Hank wiping away tears he pretended were from dust. Marshal Bridger gave her away, and when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, the marshal's voice was firm. She gives herself freely and by choice, as is her right. Because that was the truth of it. Eleanor wasn't being given or traded or saved. She was choosing Daniel, choosing this life, choosing to stop running and start building. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, food prepared by every woman in town who'd decided Eleanor was worth celebrating. There was music and dancing and laughter, and when Daniel swept Eleanor into his arms for the first waltz, she looked around at the gathered crowd, friends, neighbors, family, and realized this was what victory looked like. Not the moment she'd shot Victor Hale, though that had been necessary. Not even the trial verdict that came in September, though the guilty pronouncement on all counts was satisfying. The real victory was this, the life she'd built from ashes and terror. The family she'd protected and preserved. The The man who'd taught her that strength wasn't just about fighting, but about choosing to trust and love again. Happy? Daniel murmured against her ear as they danced. Terrifyingly happy, Eleanor admitted. Keep waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong, and if it does, we'll handle it together. He pulled back to look at her. That's what partners do. Partners, Eleanor repeated, testing the word. I like that better than wife or husband. Partners implies equality. That's because we are equals. You saved yourself, Eleanor. I just provided backup. Pretty significant backup. You'd have found a way even without me. You're that strong. Daniel spun her gently, and Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. The seasons turned. Summer faded into fall, painting the New Mexico landscape in golds and russets. Winter came with cold but manageable snows. Spring brought new calves and the first flowers pushing through still frozen ground. And through it all, the Crow Ranch thrived. Thomas grew into his role as future rancher, learning everything Daniel could teach him with the dedication of someone who'd found his calling. James discovered he had a gift with animals and spent hours training horses with a gentleness that made grown men shake their heads in wonder. Sarah bloomed in school, bringing home drawings and stories and a confidence that erased any trace of the frightened girl who'd hidden under kitchen tables. And Eleanor learned how to live without fear, how to sleep through the night without checking windows, how to accept kindness without suspicion, how to believe that good things could last. She and Daniel built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. They worked the ranch together, made decisions together, raised the children together. Some days were hard. Old trauma didn't disappear just because circumstances improved. But they faced those hard days as a team, supporting each other through nightmares and doubts, and the slow work of healing. A year after they married, Eleanor received word that Victor Hale had died in federal prison. Pneumonia, the letter said, complicated by the lung damage from her bullet and the harsh conditions of incarceration. Eleanor read the notice, folded it carefully, and put it away. She felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, no lingering anger. Victor Hale had been defeated long before he died. The moment she'd stopped running and started fighting back, he'd lost his power over her. You all right? Daniel asked that evening when he found her standing in the meadow behind the house, watching the sunset. I'm fine. Better than fine. Eleanor leaned into his embrace. I was just thinking about how far we've come, how different life is now compared to a year ago. No regrets? Not a single one. She turned to face him. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Hope, a future, a family, a home. We gave each other that, Daniel corrected. You taught me how to live again, how to open my heart when I'd convinced myself it was permanently closed, how to be the kind of man my Sarah would have wanted me to be, someone who protected the vulnerable, who stood up for what was right, who loved deeply instead of safely. They stood together as the sun painted the sky in impossible colors, two people who'd been broken by loss and fear, but had found their way to wholeness together. Around them, the ranch settled into evening, horses nickering in the corral, chickens roosting, the sound of children's laughter drifting from the house where Thomas was reading to his siblings. This was the life Eleanor had fought for. Not perfect, not without scars, but real and solid, and worth every risk she'd taken. She'd stopped running and found something better than escape. She'd found home. Years later, when people asked Eleanor about her past, she'd tell them the truth without shame. Yes, she'd been terrorized by a cruel man. Yes, she'd committed crimes to protect her children. Yes, she'd shot someone and watched him bleed. But she'd also fought back. She'd found courage when she thought she had none left. She'd trusted good people and been proven right. She'd chosen love over fear and built a life worth living. And if the story was messy and complicated and sometimes violent, well, that was the truth of survival. It wasn't pretty or simple. It was hard and desperate and required more strength than anyone should have to possess. But Eleanor had possessed it. She'd stopped running and stood her ground. She'd faced her monster and won. And in winning, she'd claimed not just victory, but the freedom to finally, truly live.